The movie opens up with a soccer game, where we meet our young main character, Mark Evans. He's having a good time playing, but suddenly his dad, Jack, appears on the field with a grim face. Seeing this, Mark realizes that something is wrong and immediately approaches him. Wasting no time, the duo rushes to the hospital. Here, we learn that Mark's mom, Janice, is sick with cancer and is in a very critical state. She just wants to see her son one last time. Sitting beside his mother, Mark promises her that she won't die and that he'll do everything to keep her alive. Janice also smiles at him and asks him to take care of himself. She tells Mark that she'll always be with him, but the little boy can't accept that. Sadly, a few moments later, Janice passes away and the scene shifts to the funeral. At his mother's funeral, Mark cries and keeps to himself, staying away from the guests and his father. Meanwhile, Jack talks to his brother Wallace about how he can't leave for an important business trip and leave Mark behind. Hearing this, Wallace offers to host Mark for the time being, and also points out that they're a family, not strangers, and being around other kids might be good for him. Finally, Jack agrees and decides to take Mark to Wallace's place in Maine himself so they can spend time together. On the way to Wallace's house, Jack tries to talk to Mark, but the latter is still in denial about his mother's death. Jack misses Janice too, but wants Mark to accept that she's gone. After a while, they arrive at Wallace's house and are greeted by Wallace, his daughter Connie, and his wife Susan. During their conversation, Connie screams as she sees her brother Henry playfully hanging upside down by the stairs wearing a scary mask. Wallace tells Henry to come down and give Mark a mask too. The latter does the same, saying that he made one for Mark so they could be like brothers. At dinner, Susan tells Jack that she's arranged for Mark to talk to a therapist named Alice Davenport, who works with Wallace at the hospital while Jack is away. Here, Henry playfully kicks Mark, and they quickly become friends. Henry then teaches Mark how to open a lobster shell, and they both have a great time, laughing and having fun. Susan quietly tells Jack that she believes Mark will be fine. After dinner, as Jack prepares to leave for Tokyo, he reminds Mark that it's only going to be for 2 weeks and that he won't have to leave him again. He encourages Mark to enjoy his winter break with his cousins and promises they'll be together soon. Before he drives away, Mark hugs his father and gets emotional. The next day, Mark wakes up to Henry playing outside and decides to join him. On his way down, Mark briefly peeks into a child's room before heading downstairs. Susan notices him, offers him breakfast, and expresses how happy they are to have him. When Henry calls out to Mark, Susan finally lets him go. In the next scene, Henry takes Mark and Connie to his treehouse, which he built by himself. Connie, being a little girl, cannot climb such a height and watches from below as the two boys get on the top of the tree. Henry reaches the top first, and as Mark tries to join him, a branch breaks, causing him to dangle from the tree with Henry holding on to him. At this moment, weirdly, Henry asks Mark if he can fly if he lets him go. But the latter doesn't answer and keeps on asking for help. However, Henry pulls him inside the treehouse, and they both lie down, catching their breath and goofing around. Afterward, the boys play in an abandoned factory, breaking windows until they're chased away by the caretaker. Following this, the two run through a cemetery and end up near a well. Here, Henry mentions that he uses it to hide his cigarettes and lights one, encouraging Mark to try it. Even though Mark mentions that cigarettes can cause cancer, he makes him try, dismissing the health concerns, saying that everyone will die anyway. Next, Henry asks Mark if he saw his mother after she died, and our boy replies that he wasn't allowed to. To Mark's annoyance, Henry requests him to describe what his mother looked like the last time he saw her. However, he gives a description of it, and listening to this, Henry describes his own experience when his little brother drowned in a bathtub, turning completely blue. Afterward, when Henry continues asking Mark about his mother's death, the latter tells him to stop talking about these horrible things. Initially, Henry threatens to throw him in a well, but later apologizes as if nothing had occurred. After apologizing, the duo reconcile by shaking hands. The following morning, as Mark and Henry walk by the dock, a dog suddenly chases them, making them run for their lives. Fortunately, they manage to reach the end of the bridge, and Henry closes the door on the dog, leaving it barking angrily. Instead of leaving, he taunts the dog by barking back, which irritates Mark, prompting him to pull his cousin away from the dog and insist they should leave. After this, Henry takes Mark to a cliff overlooking the sea, where Susan often goes in remembrance of her late son, Richard. Henry then invites Mark to his shed to show him his new invention, a makeshift gun. He aims it at a cat, and Mark loads it with a bolt, reminding Henry to scare the cat, not harm it. Henry agrees, but he misses the cat only by a few inches when he shoots. Mark is happy, while Henry looks disappointed that he didn't kill the target. Mark begins seeing a therapist, Alice Davenport, as Susan had mentioned. At first, Mark is hesitant to talk, but he eventually admits feeling alone after his mother's death. The same night, Mark hears a sound in the corridor and sees a woman in a white gown walking. He thinks it's his mother and follows her downstairs, but it turns out to be Susan. Susan notices Mark and comforts him, assuring him that she's right there with him. Here, Mark admits missing his mother, while Henry quietly watches from upstairs and gets jealous of his mother getting closer to Mark. The next day, Mark plays with Connie, and seeing this, Henry calls him to play outside. When Connie tries to join, Henry pushes her away and takes the makeshift gun to aim at the barking dog. After a while, they spot the dog and Henry shoots it, shocking Mark. The dog dies on the spot, and Henry claims that he's only scaring the dog. Next, they take the dead dog to the cemetery and throw it in a well, after which Henry hums a song, leaving Mark feeling disgusted. In the next scene, Mark is looking at photos with Susan, and in one of them sees his mother carrying him as a child. Here, when he asks Susan about Richard, Henry arrives and invites Mark to his shed. Though Mark hesitates, Susan encourages him to go. Henry takes Mark to the shed and apologizes about the dog. He then shows Mark a dummy he made, calling it Mr. Highway. Mark inquires about what they'll do with it, and Henry replies that it depends on whether he will help. Soon, the two take the dummy outside, and despite Mark stopping Henry to do it, they throw it off a bridge, causing a massive car accident. Surprisingly, Henry enjoys watching the chaos, while Mark is horrified. To their dismay, police also arrive at the scene, causing the boys to flee to a tunnel to hide. Here, Mark confronts Henry, telling him that he could have killed people, but Henry, unrepentant, implies that Mark doesn't know how to have fun. That night, Mark listens to the news about the accident and is about to tell Wallace what actually happened. However, Henry taunts him, suggesting that their father will believe him over Mark. Henry pushes the door to Wallace's office open, but afraid, Mark escapes upstairs. Wallace asks what's wrong with Mark, and Henry lies that he's been acting strangely. Next, Connie comes to Henry's room to invite him to go ice skating, but Henry gets angry at her, stating that she entered without asking. Mark defends Connie, leading to a fight between the two boys. Susan intervenes, and Henry pretends they were just playing. The next day, Alice finds Mark at the playground, where he asks her what makes people evil. She then replies that evil is just a word people use when they can't understand someone's actions, and there's usually a reason behind them. Alice also says that she doesn't believe in evil, and Mark disagrees before leaving to join Connie. During dinner, Wallace asks the boys to babysit Connie while he takes Susan out. Henry tells his mother that Mark wants to move into Richard's room, causing a heated argument between Susan and Wallace. Wallace thinks it might be a good idea, but Susan is determined to keep Richard's room as it is. Henry enjoys their argument, while Mark tries to tell them that Henry is making it up. That night, after the parents are gone, the cousins turn off the lights to play hide and seek. Henry finds Connie first and tickles her. When Mark hears her screams, he gets worried and goes to find them, offering Connie to read her a story instead. Afterward, Mark sleeps in Connie's room to protect her from Henry. The next morning, Mark wakes up and finds Connie's bed empty. He overhears Susan and Wallace talking about Richard's death, and Susan blames herself for leaving him alone in the bathtub with shallow water to answer a call. Mark also hears about Henry taking Connie for ice skating. Feeling worried for his cousin's sister, he then rushes to Miller's Pond. The pond is crowded, but he spots Henry taking Connie to a restricted area and pushing her onto thin ice. As Connie struggles in the water, Henry pretends to help her while Mark is running through the crowd. Finally, some people arrive to help and save Connie. She's then taken to the hospital and, fortunately, after some treatment, is out of danger. Next, Mark finds Susan by the cliff and tells her that Henry pushed Connie onto the thin ice and that he hates her. He also warns Susan that Henry might try to hurt Connie again. However, Susan does not believe in him and slaps Mark, thinking he's lying. She also mentions that she loves Henry and urges him never to bring such lies to her again. At the hospital that night, Henry sneaks into Connie's room to kill her, but when Susan catches him, he pretends to care for his sister and mentions he's there to take one of her pillows. Here, when the mother asks Henry what really happened on the ice, he claims that it was an accident. In the next scene, Mark talks to his father on the phone and tells him about Henry harming the neighbor's dog and Connie. Jack advises Mark to see his therapist and share what he just told him. Surprisingly, when Mark goes to Alice's house, he finds Henry already talking to her. Later, Mark meets Henry in the treehouse and taunts him. Mark warns Henry that everyone will learn the truth, especially now that he's told Susan. Despite this, Henry remains calm and threatens Mark not to mess with him. At night, Mark goes to the kitchen to find food and encounters Henry. Henry hints that he's poisoned the food in the refrigerator, prompting Mark to throw them into the sink. When Susan and Wallace arrive, Mark accuses Henry of trying to poison them, but the couple thinks otherwise and tries to calm him down, assuming that Mark might be facing some mental issues. The next day, Susan discovers Richard's rubber duck hidden in Henry's shed. She confronts Henry about it, and the latter admits it was his before it was Richard's and insists on keeping it as a memento. Susan refuses, and Henry becomes upset, causing him to snatch the toy from his mother and throw the duck into the well. In the following scene, Mark confronts Henry, who hints at hurting his own mother, stating that she now does not love him. Hearing this, Mark threatens to harm him and stop being evil. But to his bad luck, Wallace intervenes and scolds Mark. He also locks Mark in a study room and calls Alice. Through the window of the room, Mark notices Henry talking to Susan and taking her to the woods. Seeing this, Mark gets worried for her, and desperate, he breaks the window, running toward the woods. In the middle of the woods, Susan questions Henry about what happened the night Richard died. In reply, Henry claims that he was playing downstairs, but the mother doesn't believe him and inquires if he killed Richard. To her shock, in response, Henry asks what she'd do if he did and runs away. Susan follows him and eventually catches up at a cliff. Here, Henry pushes her off the cliff, causing her to tumble and grab onto a branch. Fortunately, when Henry tries to drop a rock on her, Mark arrives just in time and stops him. While the two boys fight, Susan manages to climb up. During the fight, both of them slip at the edge, but Susan manages to grab them by their hands. It is evident that Susan has the strength to pull only one of the boys. Henry frequently asks his mother to give him both hands, insisting that she let Mark fall to his death. But after realizing her son's evil nature and that he is the one who drowned Richard, Susan lets go of Henry to save Mark. Henry falls to his death, and Susan hugs Mark after pulling him to safety. In the last scene, Mark is standing in front of the Arizona mountains and reflecting on the incident. The movie ends with him wondering if Susan would make the same choice again if she could go back in time.